I try in these high holy days to give you words and thoughts that might do more than simply inspire, raise an eyebrow, but maybe, like a band, might actually create a tangible change in your lives. I think that's what ultimately we need, and I think what I realized through my work in Africa and at UCLA earlier in the year was that's what people want. They want what we call takeaways. Not just theories and ideas. They want something they can go home with in their hand or in their mind that say, I now have letters, tools, ideas, a band, something to do something with. So with that in mind, I'll end with tools, but I'll begin with inspiration, words, an idea, a rabbi that inspired me, still inspires me, called the Kotzker Rebbe, somebody of the late 18th and early mid-19th century. He lived to the middle of that century. And the Kotzker Rebbe was one of the most beautiful and inspiring Hasidim, but he wasn't always a Hasid. And one of his students asked him once, so, Rebbe, when did you become a Hasid? What happened that became you, that converted you to Hasidut? And the Rebbe said, I had a teacher. And the student said, well, he must an extraordinary teacher. He must have been charismatic and wise and learned and a great communicator. And the Kotzker Rebbe said, no, he was very simple. He taught what he knew, and I heard what I needed. And I think that's why I'm here. I teach what I know, not what somebody else knows. I'm sure people are finding their wisdom in other places. I teach what I know and hope that in these days of awe, you'll hear something that you need. And I think that's what we're congregated up here to do, which is to teach what we know in words, in songs, in prayer, and to hope that each of you and each of them, each of us will see in it what we need. I think of another great rabbi, the Rav he was known as, and I remember speaking of him last year, saying that when his sons buried him, Rav Soloveitchik, they did a play on words on his plaque, on his tombstone. The word Rav means rabbi, but the word Rav also means full of, embodying. So instead of saying that their father, the great Talmudist, was the Rav Soloveitchik, instead they called him simply Rav Chesed, full of compassion. And the Rav Soloveitchik was asked by someone once, presumably a student of a kind, can't we pray to God anywhere? Why do we need to go to the synagogue? And the Rav said, you're right. We can ask things of God anywhere. But it's only in the synagogue that we hear what God asks of us. And that's why we're here, to hear what God asks of us. It's different than standing on a mountaintop. It's different than wandering through the roads of our lives, creating maps and journeys for ourselves. Sometimes we need to come to holy places for a holy convocation, a gathering of people to read words that were written for us so that ultimately we could come away changed, not only inspired, but change, inspiration to action, the intangible to the tangible. So that each of us in these days and hours between last week's service, the beginning when we lit those 2 candles and said Kiddush, to the end of Havdalah when I'll be desperate for that Kiddush, between those cups of wine, that each of us will come to a place of perhaps greater clarity of knowing what is it that God actually asks of me. So what it means is that these high holy days are days of self-exploration. It says on certain pages, it says time for introspection. And if you think about what we do every age of our life, every time we come back to these places, is we make introspection. We look within, but an introspection isn't simply on one level. It's a spiral that deepens. Because every time we make time for introspection, every time we look acutely at ourselves, we see more deeply who we are. And I think, as I alluded to in one sermon on Rosh Hashanah, as we age, we come to wisdom. And we start to see what we have not been and what we might be, what we might do in light of what we see in that mirror. Martin Buber, who wrote so many beautiful books, a great inspirer, a great thinker, was asked about his early books in one interview, and he said, I don't even read my early works. He said, I knew nothing then. And I think many of you, many of us, say the same about early works and early words that we said. I look back on school papers. I remember one day finding in a filing cabinet at home my bar mitzvah speech. And I thought, wow, that rabbi let me get away with a lot, because that was an awful speech. When we come to introspection, we come to do something again. What God asks us to do in these holy days, whatever we understand those three words, letters, God to be, G-O-D, Adonai, Elohim, Eloheinu, El Shaddai, higher power, whatever that word means to us, we're in that kind of encounter in these days. And maybe it's with a metaphysical God that transcends our world, or maybe it's with an image God that's with us in this world, or maybe it's simply a chance to find God within us, our conscience, our knowing self. And when we come to these times, our tradition says clearly what God's asking of us. We don't have to wonder. Our mission in these days is to renew ourselves. Not to change to be someone we aren't, because we can't be and we shouldn't be, but to enlarge who we are. Think about that story of Jacob. Jacob, the night before he's going to re-encounter his estranged brother, Esau, after the tragedy of 20 years lost in a brotherly relationship, he has a dream. He puts his head on a stone and he lies down and he dreams. And in that dream, it says in the Torah distinctly, it says, I'll find the text exactly because I want to quote it correctly. It says, Vayivater Yaakov levado. And the Hebrew means, and Jacob remained there alone. But then it says that until dawn, he encountered and wrestled with an ish. And an ish simply means in Torah, or in modern parlance, it means a man. So how is it, the rabbis and we ask, that Jacob was alone? Because the rabbis say distinctly, look, the editor, the author of Torah says, puts in a line that's necessary that we know that there wasn't another man there. He was alone. And yet he encountered a man and wrestled with him all night. And I think, and maybe you'll agree, that the man that he met and wrestled with was Jacob. Because there are those moments, those epiphanies, when we come to grapple with who we are. That's wrestling. It's pinning ourselves down to the mat to say, let's not rise until you and I and me, know truly who we can be in this world. Let's struggle. If we wake up injured, we'll wake up stronger nonetheless. What happened to Jacob when he awoke from that dream? He became Yisrael. God said after that kind of encounter, you can no longer be Jacob. Jacob is a name that a parent gives a child. You're larger than that. You're Yisrael. You are the father of people, a nation who will be inspired by that struggle, your struggle. Because people will come to see in all the generations of Jewish life that it matters to struggle. That ours has never been, and as Keith said, is not an easy path, and yet is valuable and meaningful. And what ultimately will strengthen our souls and our muscles will be our struggles. We know that as parents, that the more we do for our children to make their lives soft and easy, to make every landing soft and easy, the less we strengthen their behinds and all the aspects of who they are. The more we use our muscles, ultimately God says, and we say, the more they will rely on us and not be able to use their own. Jacob becomes Yisrael, and yet if you listen to what was said moments ago when we prayed the Amidah, we didn't mention Jacob's name as Yisrael. We said Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Velohei Yaakov. So again, we still recognize his name that his father and mother gave him, Jacob. And maybe the lesson in that might be that we never lose who our parents made us. But ultimately, we transform ourselves over and over and over again in our lives until we come to see who God made us, until we come to look in a different mirror. Long after we need the affection and praise of our parents, we come into a relationship with ourselves and God that says, now it's time to need to praise myself. Now it's time to find the glory in this creation that I can be, the potential that I've been given. Imagine someone who has limbs and muscles and a brain and a soul but doesn't use them fully. It's like a balloon full of air but only letting some of it out. It's like music playing with half a lung and not a whole lung when you have that ability. It's like sustaining a phrase longer and more beautifully. It's realizing that what we were given was this extraordinary potential. that everyone was given ability and disability, but God forbid, and we should forbid, that the disability should be of our own mind's doing. That when we come to encounter ourselves on holy days, it's to realize a holy perspective on this human self that we are. In all the ages of our life, as teenagers, as parents, as grandparents, in all the ages and stages of life, to say, as fragile or as strong as I believe I am, let me look fully at who God sees me as. Let me take that lens, that perspective. I could go to the DMV or look on a roster that we have in our office to find out when each of you was created. That's factual. But I can't find out when you recreated your own selves, because that's your story. I don't know about that encounter with yourself. I don't know if it's happened yet or if it's about to happen. I don't know if you had Jacob's moment, if you've ever wrestled yourself to the ground and said, let's not come up until we're stronger and have a greater sense of what we're here to do. Do we have a strategy for our lives, or do we simply float buffeted by the courses and currents of time and tide? If you think about change, change happens in two ways in life. One is that we propel it, we choose it, and the other is that it happens to us. It's like a ship captain who looks in the distance with a course in sight, a port in sight, and then suddenly realizes, despite his best intentions, he has to change course because tide and current no longer allow him to travel to that place. That's divorce. That's loss of a loved one. That's unemployment and underemployment. It's those realities that are in our lives that happen to us. And then, like Jacob, it's time to wrestle and say, but who will I become through this? What will this teach me? If God asks us to do something which is to renew ourselves, it is to recreate, not create. God created the world once, but then Adam wasn't taught what creation was. Adam was taught what it means to recreate. That's what we're taught, to recreate. When a couple gets married under the chuppah, in a sense, we don't marry them. They're not marrying each other. They're remarrying each other. Because our mystical tradition teaches us that there's no such thing as uniting. There's only reuniting. Because every one of us, every pair was once coupled, and now we simply find each other. And when we celebrate a couple on that day, what we're celebrating is that, thank God, they found themselves and each other again. Think about dedication and rededication. Think about the temple in Jerusalem, Solomon's temple. Who knows on what date in our calendar Solomon's temple was dedicated? It was Sukkot. Most people don't know that. That's just a fact that you find if you look for strange facts. But if I ask most of our kids and Jules or most of you, when was the temple rededicated? Most people will know. It's Hanukkah. The word Hanukkah means rededication. So there's something about redoing that's valuable in Jewish life. We call a holiday rededication, not dedication. Think about the teachers, the administrators that are here from schools. There's one thing to have the first day of school. It's like the wedding. But then every day after that, it's like the marriage. It's easy to create a beautiful wedding. Anyone can do that. But to create a beautiful marriage is extraordinary. It takes not dedicating, but rededicating ourselves to what we once stood there for. It means that every pursuant day after that first day becomes a convocation of our thoughts, a bringing together of our values and our ideals. We say, once we stood on day 1, but what will we stand for on day 30 when life gets challenging? And 50 and 300 and 600. And when we come around that bend again to Elul and come to this holy day, what will it mean to rededicate our lives? I think about rededication and I think about what we're meant to do, which is to find out and ask ourselves questions that God asks us, which might be simply to look at ourselves as a unit, as an entity, as a company of people, as an individual, a pair, a couple, or a family, to say, what are we here for? What are we dedicating our lives to? Do we have any idea what our values actually are? Have we asked one another or ourselves, what are my values, what I stand for, what I won't stand for? And another question we might ask ourselves is, does anyone know that about me? Do the people who know me know what I stand for? Would they know my values? If they know that I'm Jewish because they heard something about a matzah ball or saw a star, do they know what Judaism stands for other than high cholesterol? Do they realize something about me, that I'm an embodiment of a people's idea of what we're supposed to do in this world? Is that what they see in the way I live my life? Do they see someone who's actually living a set of values? Do they see a family raising kids by values, not simply by schedules? I remember a year ago, one of our families told me that after Yom Kippur, they were inspired by some words of a sermon. They said, let's take them seriously. And they created a little family retreat right after the holy days. They left. They went away with their kids, took them out of school for a couple more days, and they said, let's make meaning of what we just did. And they stopped and they went away to look at their lives, to say, what are we about as a family? Maybe that's something to do this year. Maybe the question that God is asking is not what, but when will you? When will you stop and consider how important you are to me? When will you stop to realize the investment that you can make in other people and the investment ultimately that will be in yourself? I said that I'd give you tools, and I want to give you tools that I think are extraordinary. I think if you think about change, one thing that we know about change is if it matters, it's challenging, and if it matters, it's ambitious. Otherwise, I wouldn't say dedicate yourself to it. There are tiny course changes, but there are grand ones that will change our lives. So I asked you at the beginning of the service, what is it that you might want to change? What do you think you're here for? And I want to ask you now to consider that for a moment. I'll leave a pause, a silence. Fill in that blank. What is the most vital change that I want to make in my life in this new year that begins 10 days ago and continues today? And I'll remind you to be ambitious. I'll also remind you of a people standing with a man with a staff at a sea. Moses stood at a sea of reeds, and the people were behind him. And what did they have to do to create the most important change in their lives and ours? They had to go from the present to the future. But what we realize about change is it doesn't happen that way. You have to have a transition. And the transition was a body of water and a wilderness that nobody wanted to cross. Nobody wanted to cross into that abyss, even if it meant that they would find their future, because it's terrifying. And change is ultimately terrifying. When we become a bar mitzvah and our parents say, today you become a man, what a terrifying idea that now we have to change something about our identity. But what a liberating concept that our parents said, we now consider you to be an adult. Make that ambitious change in your life because it'll be extraordinary. Remember that there were 3 archetypes of one man at the Sea of Reeds. We're told that Moses held a staff over the water, but that nothing happened until Nachshon ben Aminadav had the willingness to jump into the water, and then the waters parted. So one midrash says that Nachshon pushed past the throngs of people so that he could be the first one to plunge into the water. That's one form of change. Maybe you've experienced that. I want it. I'll be the one to make it happen. There's another midrash of the same man. It says that he was pushed reluctantly backwards. People in the throng, in the crowds, pushed him until ultimately he fell backwards into the water. We've all experienced that. Change was thrust upon us. We didn't ask for it, but ultimately it liberated us if we were able to see with God's eyes what that change could be. If we could sweeten, as the Baal Shem Tov said, what we might have seen as bitter in that moment. But I think the third midrash is some ways the most poetic, the most beautiful one of Nachshon. It says that this man got to the water like you and I. And he had the same misgivings and fears about stepping into that water as you and I would, but he put one foot in and he expected it to part. But nothing happened. So he took another step and now he was up to his ankles and nothing happened. And then, like us, he said, is change happening or isn't it? But he put another step into the water. Now he was up to his knees, and still he looked up and said, when will it come? When will these waters miraculously part? I'm doing my part. And then he got up to his waist, and still nothing happened in his world. And ultimately, the Midrash says that he got up to where the water was at his lower lip. And it was only at that point, when he risked everything, when he took that next step forward, that the waters parted. That's change. That's courage. That's ambition. That's realizing the words you just said to yourselves 5 minutes ago matter. That you can do that. That sometimes it takes praying to God, but sometimes it simply takes walking forward. It takes putting one foot in front of the next and doing the hard work that's required to transition from what we were to what we ultimately can be. So I want to give you tools, and the tools this time don't snap on your wrist and move from hand to hand. They're letters. And the letters are ADKAR, ADKAR. So I'm going to say it 19 times because I want it to become something that you go away with, and at breakfast tonight you remember, next Thursday you still remember. ADKAR, the first beginning of change is awareness, the A. We can't change unless we're aware, wholly aware of what needs to change and why it matters. Is there an urgency to the change, or does it not matter? And I'd suggest if there's no urgency, stop and think again about what really needs to change in your lives. So the A is awareness. Am I fully cognizant of what this change means and what it will mean in my life and to the people around me? And the second in ADKAR, that's the first repetition, is D. The second is D, and the D is desire. And I have to tell you, that's the most difficult aspect of change. It's determination. It is motivation. Every single human being loses motivation on any journey greater than a step. Every single person loses their motivation. So what we have to steep ourselves in is motivations. So that when those times come, when the fast gets difficult at 12:55, we'll have a motivation to continue to fast through the break. And when we come ultimately to 4:15 this afternoon, we'll have a different motivation that we need then. And if we don't know what the motivation is, then we pair with people in our lives, one of the important aspects of change. We make cohesive groups. We make collaborations with people. And we say, when I need motivation, I'll look to you. When you need a motivation, look to me. So we have awareness and determination, but I would tell you that there's still no change happening in most people's lives. The next letter in ADKAR is K. And K is knowledge. Do we actually know what needs to be done? Do we understand it? Do we need education? Do we need to read or ask someone? Do we need to go to our doctor and say, I know I need to change my diet, my health, but explain it to me in a way that I'll actually have the knowledge that will compel me to do something about this time. Because I know, I've read, I've heard my whole life, but now I actually need to have that knowledge. And after A of awareness and D of determination and K of knowledge comes another A, and it's ability. And ability reminds me that once I was on an airplane, actually on the way to Africa last year, and I read an English newspaper, and it showed David Beckham teaching how to kick the perfect kick. Now, I read it, and if you looked at it, it pointed to his foot, and it pointed to angles on his leg, and his calf, and his heel, and all these parts I didn't know I had, and his knee, and his hip, and even his head. And ultimately, I could then recite, I had the knowledge of how to kick a David Beckham goal. But I didn't have the ability. There's a difference between our knowledge and our ability. So the question is, what do we need to do to have the ability to actually change that's different from the motivation? Are we actually equipped with the abilities to make change happen in our families, in our homes, in our marriages, in our health, in our spiritual life, in our community, Valley Outreach Synagogue, and in our own sense of self? And I've taken you from A to A. ADKAR ends in R. And the last one is so human and so necessary. It's reward and recognition. It's reinforcement. It's treating yourself when you do something well. It's saying, if I make it to day 21 with this band, reducing my motivation to complain, hearing myself, that on day 21, I'm going to do something that's a celebration of the achievement, because it's an extraordinary achievement not to complain. It's a magnificent achievement simply to reduce complaining, as one example. So I remind you that the tools are ADKAR. The A is awareness. The K is, the D is, the K is, the A is, And the R is reinforcement and reward. So now you have 3 minutes early, a break. I want to ask you to consider that as you move forward with this new year. I hope it's helpful to you. As I said, all we can do is teach what we know and hope that you'll hear what you need. What I want to ask is, I want to just give you the programming to the end of the day so you have an expectation. In half an hour, we have fabulous speakers in discussion groups. Keith will lead a group in APAC, continuing that discussion. We have a grief group being led by Dr. Neil Einbun. We have a program on forgiveness that you know is being led in one of the rooms upstairs. We also have a program, 5 professional panelists talking about what do we need to consider as we age from a medical point of view, housing, challenges of relocating or not, all the realities for children of aging parents and for parents themselves. In the sanctuary, we have a 12-step gratitude meeting. These start at 1:30. One of the absolute highlights of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur is coming to the end together. So I want to motivate you. Please come back. Join us for the afternoon service. Be here for Yizkor and come to the end. Ne'ilah is extraordinarily beautiful, ending in all of us together for Havdalah. Thank you. Gmar Chatimat Tovah. May you be inscribed and sealed in the book of life.